If someone asked me to play a ruler in a movie one day, I would not choose the role of Cleopatra, but Theodora. She is definitely the most powerful woman of the East until moment when came era of Tale by Nisvan, but also the most difficult to understand and portray. Maybe that's why no one has tried to make a film about her. It is truly an extraordinary story in every respect: social advancement, church reform, that what happened next, an ideal relationship that had nothing to do with love, but both sides were able to make themselves indispensable and, finally, save the empire or the disappearing branch of Christianity. Theodora is by far the most powerful basileus in the history of Byzantium. She will forever remain the most powerful woman in the East. Calling a spade of the worst gutter whore, she is promoted to empress. She creates a prayer that most Christians say to this day even though they don't know it, credo. She brutally eliminates her opponents, pacifies Nika revolt, and finally becomes a saint. In her case, dreams come true and bad deeds get away with it. Many wonder why Theodora acted the way she did, but the answer is very simple. She was motivated by hunger and ambition. This is what creatures who experienced hunger and find their way to the manger do, but in the background they have the thought that they may lose it and return to begging. Theodora is like a starving dog. On the internet you can often see very stupid videos created by charlatans called behaviorists about how a dog should not bite a person if he sees him as an alpha. First of all, the alpha theory was disproved many years ago, since wolves returned to the wild. We know that we choose a leader depending on the situation, although they do not deny 90% of the reproductive rights of those leaders who are chosen most often. Kings and emperors. Secondly, any dog that starved for a long time and someone would try to take away its bowl will fight for it, and the one that had to fight for food will learn for years to get rid of this reaction. I say this with full awareness as a continuator of the family tradition and a descendant of the managers of the Tsarist hunting estate, who took care of the Tsar's dogs for more over 200 years, and also took care of them after the fall of Tsarism, the property in which the abdication took place. Those who tell you otherwise have no idea about animals. In American science books you can proudly read that a scientist fed a raven with French fries. It does not say how long this raven lived. French fries are not for ravens. This is a similar example. Such a book should not be published, and such a person should not be a scientist, unless he writes about animal poisoning. I always say that we should not look at the mentality of people from previous eras through our prism, because someone will judge our mentality not very well. Times and the concept of good or evil are changing. These are very relative concepts. Although sociology, which would make it easier for those in power to govern, tells us otherwise. Nevertheless, in her own time, Theodora's actions were not considered moral by her contemporaries. We only know two images of Theodora. One is a mosaic in Ravenna, which was part of Byzantium at that time, and a sculpture in Milano. Both show a determined, tough person who knows what he wants and will not give in. Livia Augusta is an angel next to her. The author of Credo has come a long way. How did it begin? According to legend, Theodora dreamed of Flavius. This is, of course, propaganda nonsense. She was suggested to him by the Nestorian leaders. Certainly, when she was prepared for this plan, they told her about him. There were never any dreams about the future basileus, but there was a lot of calculation. Theodora and Justinian, i.e. Flavius Petrus Sabatinus, had no children. He will became Justinian will later. They couldn't have them. Theodora did not even hide the fact that she often performed very primitive abortions. The last one permanently damaged her uterus, even though she had a daughter from the times when she was involved in prostitution. Perhaps not one, because the sisters raised their own children. From her stay in the Middle East with Hecabolos. There are some indications that the man to whom she was a courtesan that he infected her with something and the uterus had to be removed. With something and her uterus had to be removed. It is not known how this relates to later accusations of uterine cancer, because it does not grow back. Perhaps Theodora, contrary to the agreement, became pregnant while trying to settle the governor, which could have been the reason for her expulsion. She performs an abortion, which went completely wrong and ends her reproductive potential, the loss of which she will greatly regret in a few years, and will even lead to a murder solely caused by obsession and gossip. Interestingly, Theodora will remain jealous of other women until her death. Suffice it to say that someone smiled at Justinian and frowned. This is a bad sign and an announcement that he will end up in the cisterns of Haghia Sophia. There he murders and tortures his opponents. We know that out of jealousy she sentenced the innocent Amalasuntha to death, because she believed the rumors that Justinian would divorce her for the Goths' queen, because she would at least give him an heir. However, Theodora never cared about the burden of children, unless they could be used politically. Some rightly noticed that the court turned into a brothel during Theodora's reign, as notables were forced to marry her sisters and friends. It was even believed that her reproductive organ cancer was a result of her profession. These are, of course, rumors spread by the people with a negative attitude towards her, because having sex has little to do with uterine cancer, if indeed it was the cause of her death and, as we mentioned above, it may not have been uterine cancer. These are myths that you can still hear. However, this does not change the fact that Theodora was substituted to Justinian, and the Nestorian and early Christian churches used her because of her lack of virtues. Theodora was the daughter of Akakios, bear trainer, i.e., someone who trains dancing bears. It is very doubtful that this element of the Middle Eastern landscape will disappear quickly. At that time, a trident was used for this purpose. Theodora's father died when she was a child and he belonged to the Green Party. And here it is necessary to tell a little about the first political brothel, later called parties. In the Eastern Empire, something was formed that is today considered to be the nucleus of political parties, but it is difficult to determine whether they are political parties or gangs of brutal football hooligans from the stadium, because both features can be attributed to these organizations, as well as functioning like a sect and a Masonic lodge, because these people support each other, hide their crimes, have their money transfers and at the same time demand full loyalty. We have two factions, green and blue, which are initially focused on tournaments at the Hippodrome. Over time, they will start fielding their own players, and over time, those parties will control districts through activities reminiscent of today's mafia activities, mainly through intimidation. These two factions eventually control the city. They are a bit like the later Janitsary. When they don't like something they simply start a rebellion and destroy the city. Was the episode about them? Needless to say, if one of the representatives lost the competition, brawls broke out in the city because the blue representative won, not the green one, and vice versa. At the same time, members of these groups are very loyal to each other. Theodora's father died in one of such brawls. Another version claims that the bear returned the favor. Theodora often was confused in her biography, and biographers also tried to erase and add splendor and seriousness to a woman for whom it was difficult to add anything. These gangs not accepted even knowledge about unaffiliated people, and what's worse, over time, wealthy people with political connections start to put pressure through these gangs, as well as the gangs on their people connected on the court. Over time, Theodora will begin to announce to everyone that she is a native of Constantinople, but this is not true. She wasn't born in the city. She needed a better biography. The mother is not known by name, and this is a curiosity, because we are talking about someone who actually ruled the empire. Let's not believe too much that Theodora's mother was a descendant of a famous general. He would have to be very hated, and even then we would have some information about this family. It's propaganda. If that were the case, then the mother would never have become the wife of a bear trainer in the first place. These animals were also trained for fighting, in addition to dancing. They had similar status of a gladiator slave, so you can sleep with them but not marry them if you have a minimal position in society. We would then know who this woman was, and certainly her daughters would not be very lowly prostitutes. It is also doubtful that the general's daughter would pimping her own children. She lived in a concubinage that excluded her from society, and she put on such a show in the amphitheater that she did. Everything that Theodora's mother did, as well as her intentional erasure, proves one thing. It was a hereditary profession in this family. After her husband's death, she quickly became involved with Asterios, who as well was bear trainer, but most likely she did not marry him. Which, especially in those times, raises many questions. This era of the beginnings of Christianity, but as well the time when Christian tolerance slowly is disappearing. Of course, in the East there will never be such powerful fanatical religious movements as in the West, but they will be there, as exemplified by the death of Hypatia. Let us also mention where the hippodrome was, because it is still there. It was located between today's Haghia Sophia and Ahmed Kami. If we look at the square from a bird's eye view, we will notice that it is a hippodrome. Today, standing in the square, it is not very obvious, because we no longer have the emperor's palace adjacent to Haghia. We need this to understand the reasons why Nico was pacified the way it was. Asterios, also a bear trainer, became the stepfather. He was not a stepfather in the legal sense, because her mother became a concubine, which was condemned at that time. There could even have been some bigamy there, perhaps Asterios had a wife. The stepfather also lost his job due to parties' conflict. The choice of the new bear trainer belonged to the prima ballerina associated with the green ones, and mom somehow did not take this into account for the person who chose someone else for a bribe, of course. Asterios somehow got the job, only to lose it later. After all, he was Blue Dot, and here Theodora enters the stage for the first time, only to disappear for a while. Blues are starting to become more popular in the city, and Asterios does not want to retrain. He probably as well was double spy. It seems that he was not a very hard-working man, but everyone's stomach is the same. Theodora's mother comes up with a brilliant plan to involve the guard of the amphitheater, not the hippodrome. They will perform during the break of animal fights. They practice for hours. They weave wreaths and their clothes are supposed to be very transparent. After the stepfather lost his job, the mother and daughters appeared in the amphitheater in very skimpy outfits. They carry garlands and empty baskets, weep and recite poems. Even in those times, no beggar would have dared to engage in such a circus, knowing that the emperor could sit in the box. It also shows the way of thinking and cunning of this family. Finally, they throw garlands on the notables and beg for food. Then Asterios rose from his seat and looked at his former employers with sad eyes. It was a show the city had never seen before. Soon he would see more of them. With this performance, they deliberately caused a brawl, because the Blues interfered and started insulting the Greens. We didn't mention one thing. Asterios was kicked out because he cooperated with both factions. The scene was described by the then historian Procopius with explicit comments. Since then, the stepfather has been working for the Blues in the same position. This political brothel certainly reminds us of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, or indeed it is supposed to. This is the legendary Byzantine policy. Not exaggerated by any means, but digging holes under itself and murdering when necessary. Twisted and using primitive methods, as well as a lot of propaganda. From that moment on, the family is associated with the Blues, and Theodora, like Sister Komito, appear at the hippodrome whenever they want. Komito was the first to hit the stage. They will call themselves theater actresses, but there is a problem. These performances are not even category D, and they are not performances even according to ancient theaters. This is low-level entertainment, and the work involves not only taking part in very erotic performances, but also having sex with clients. Komito actually supports this family, and Theodora is subservient to her. She serves her, she calls herself a little slave, and there are many strange relationships in this relationship that perhaps shouldn't occur. It's hard to compare these performances to anything today. Even pole dancing has more artistry. This pastime is gone. Although shows involving sex on stage are back. It was something like that, and it's not fake sexual intercourse. Perhaps Theodora also did not despise being a women's courtesan, which was truly unacceptable in those times, as this can be deduced from Procopius's allusions. Some contemporary authors try to defend Theodora by saying that she did not have enough money for bread and had no other options. She might not have had the opportunity if her mother was not a general's daughter, but a socially lowlands one, and then it was really difficult to break out, but then again, this is Constantinople. Not a province. There are plenty of opportunities here if you have at least some non-marginal origins. We can therefore assume that they were descendants of people with a poor, even exclusionary, social status. The most famous depictions of Theodora are the scenes with Leda, when the birds peck the grains from her womb. She often appears naked and presents her charms quite vulgarly. Theodora was created for this role from an early age, and all daughters are trained by their mothers, so the answer is clear. It was thanks to this training that she acquired a man's wit, sharp tongue and self-confidence, which women from normal homes of that time, especially patrician ones, lack. Could she entertain 10 at once? We don't know that. It was written by an author who was unfavorable to her. However, she must have been good at her job, because she quickly took away her sister's clients and gained the opportunity to visit the richest and most influential people. That's how she goes up. She becomes the equivalent of today's escort, although she starts out as the worst type of prostitute, which Komito was, as her body quickly becomes deformed by numerous pregnancies. It is no secret that pregnancy deforms the body. Who does he credit for reaching the palaces? Probably not his mother. Historiographies mention a mysterious man in a green cloak, whom her mother may have introduced her to, or may have become her pimp when he saw her during a performance. Whoever he was knew who to introduce her to. Theodora was sensitive about her appearance. She was able to spend days in beauty salons and improve her appearance, even with primitive, let's call it, plastic surgery at that time. Finally, I get involved with a certain Hecabolos, the governor of Pentapolis in today's Libya, and here a new myth of Theodora begins to be born. Theodora certainly imagined this relationship differently, but she partly worked for that. It is not known how he and Hecabolos met. He was probably one of the customers. Regional churches created story about this relationship differently, but it's hard to believe. This new role for Theodora becomes Kyria, i.e., a high-ranking concubine, whose role is not much different from wives. The problem is that this woman in the gynaeceum cannot live, and she has no topics for conversation with other women, even if she was in lesbian relationships. The partner was busy with work, and there was no entertainment like in Constantini. It seems that Theodora is not up to the role of a concubine of such a high-ranking lord. In those times, she feels great in the company of drunken soldiers, but in the role of someone who has to fulfill the appearance of a virtuous lady. There was no one to teach her. The Syrian churches present this story completely differently. Hecabolos was supposed to be her guardian, who would lead her souls to return to society and salvation, because Theodora goes here to repent and become a new person. Why then did he drive her away? Only the sources of the Nestorian churches create these stories about the patron saint of converted sinner, which will be needed later in the game for the souls of the faithful. Beautiful, but later actions contradict this, and besides, Hecabolos took great care to ensure that her presence was not discovered by the priests. Why is the myth of noble Theodora born here? Because to some of those priests who do not mind the company of concubines, Hecabulos introduces Theodora. She certainly met John in the palace, who would create the legend of Saint Theodora until the end of his days. John will be her most faithful supporter, servant. John is a Nestorian. He is a relative of the prefect of Zotico, a bishop. And they probably met at some common banquet. We do not know whether Hecabulos was also associated with them, or whether it was due to religious tolerance, which was decreasing. And it's probably time to mention who the Nestorians are. Nestorianism is one of the doctrines of Middle Eastern Christianity professing the Monophysitism of Jesus. According to their church rules, Jesus is not the Son of God. This is a canonical rule opposed to the Diphysitism represented by most post-Roman churches. Christianity was not unanimous on this issue for a long time, and in the times of Theodora, battles with this view began, and we can safely say that thanks to her this view survived, although not on such a scale as the Monophysites would have liked. Its heirs are the existing to this day, the Assyrian Church, the Chaldean Church and the Eastern Churches, which repudiated the doctrine of Nestorius, and the ancient Church of the East. Of course, there is also Monophysitism, which believes that divine nature has absorbed human nature. Developed by Julian of Halicarnassus in Egypt. In time, some churches will support it. Its successors are the existing Coptic, Syriac Orthodox Church, Syriac Jacobite Church of India and Malankara Orthodox Church, Ethiopian Orthodox Church and Eritrean Orthodox Church. Monophysitism, as some search engines would have it, does not only concern the divine nature. As the name suggests, it is a term for one nature, and there is no agreement on one nature. And we can go back to the future for a moment, because it should be noted that Islam in this part of the world does not coexist with physical Christianity, which raises the question why so many Muslims from those regions still accuse their neighbors of considering Jesus, or Isa, to be a divine being, and not the prophet that he is. This is the most common accusation against Arab churches, which is the source of wars. It's safe to say that either someone doesn't make people aware, or people don't want to learn about themselves, because this view is not everywhere. There is no virgin, and in all Eastern churches there is no Holy Trinity. Sophia is not Holy Trinity. It's safe to say that or someone doesn't particularly make people aware, or people don't want to learn about themselves, because this view does not exist there. There is no virgin either. And this view will pass into Islam. Jesus is a very important figure in the Quran. He is the predecessor of Muhammad, but we do not find him in Judaism. It's worth reminding about this. He can't be there. It's an earlier religion. Book religions come from Zoroastrianism, not Judaism. This is the second religion of the book. However, the Avesta will have an impact on the Gnosticism emerging in Theodora's era. But she doesn't fight for it. Let's go back to Hecabulos. A man considered to be very peaceful, who, contrary to the Nestorian texts, did not leave his lover without money, did not beg on the street, nor did she wear penitential black robes to erase her sins. Perhaps she actually went to a monastery for a few days to stay overnight, but that was it. There were no hotels in that part of the world. Could Theodora have gotten pregnant to force Hecabulos into a relationship? Maybe. That would explain his reaction, or indeed, as some say, he had a lot of horns. She is marginal, but financially independent. It's temporary, she simply has to start selling the property left overseas in order to return. Did he turn his eyes towards another? It is unknown, but he may have wanted to get promoted, and for this he needed a completely different wife. It is known that the plan to entrap the notable by her mother and her probably did not work out. The fact is that she squandered a large part of her fortune to attract the attention of the notable. Being a Kyria is a huge promotion for her. We must also mention that Theodora left her daughter in the capital, but she does not care much about her. She has to go home. To do this, she visits John and asks for help in reaching the port of Alexandria. John sees this as an excellent opportunity. A conflict over the nature of Christ is raging in Byzantium. It was John who was supposed to send her to this monastery. First nights under the open sky? Doubtful. John was probably informed through the monastery. John will create the legend of Theodora and change the facts. He has a goal in this. He introduces her to Eutyches of Alexandria. We do not know whether he did it in Libya or already in the city. The fact is that thanks to these connections, Theodora participates in the synod. She is the only woman who takes part in it, although she does not have a voice. She is perfectly familiar with both streams of Christianity and the motivations that drive the bishops. Eutyches and John want to prepare her for the dispute that he will one day lead on their behalf in the capital. All this so that Monophysitism would get into the palace and change the fate of the church, and Diophysitism would disappear. We really could not spread the word about the Son of God longer, but Theodora lived too short a life, although she almost made it. In Alexandria she also meets Severus, who is persecuted by Justinian, and Timothy, but she will also be introduced to Caesarea, a woman related to Basileus Anastasios who will take her under her protection. Whatever this sentence in the books means in the case of Theodora. While the churches of that region want to see Theodora as a penitent, the story is terrible. Theodora did not give up her profession, in fact her profession was to become a virtue. According to legend, she was supposed to have dreamed of Flavius. This is of course nonsense, but she could have heard about it from John, Timothy, and above all Caesarea. It is the authors of the Syrian church who will make her a converted poor woman who stood in rags under the governor's palace and had nothing to eat or drink. This image will help in her canonization. They will create someone she was not. Theodora never got rid of the ugly mafia habits of playing situations to her advantage. Some were praiseworthy and brought her, and Justinian, glory in history, but others unfortunately cast a shadow over Justinian, although it is doubtful that he knew that his wife was plotting this. The truth is that the faction has arranged for her to perform in theater on the route, so she earns money to travel back, spies for the faction and travels quite well. Has she been to Palestine? That may be a legend. There is another theory about the breakup with Hecubulus, which does not seem far-fetched at all, and was put forward by an Italian historian. The Blue faction in Alexandria and Antioch had a very well-developed let's call it network. Theodora could simply have been a spy sent to the council, because it is quite difficult to explain that she is greeted in Antioch by the dancer Macedonia, who is known as Justinian's spy. It is Macedonia who introduces her to Justinian. She will send a letter praising her virtues, which are so necessary in the profession of a spy. Did Theodora take her place in the bed? It is not known. It is no secret that even today, actors who have the opportunity to travel the world often moonlight as agents. Theodora sees this as an opportunity. She even gives up several performances organized by the Blues and returns to the capital as soon as possible. Flavius came from the area of present-day Macedonia. His town is today a district of Skopje. He was not stupid. He established links with the capital under Anastasius through his uncle Justin, who was illiterate, but thanks to his nephew he climbed ever closer to the basileus. Justin adopted Flavius, gave him a new name and educated him. Very well, but he quickly saw the boy as a threat and wanted to sentence him to death, but the order was not carried out. When Anastasius died, he left no descendants or a will. Justinian knew what to do. He had to pay and promise. His uncle became the emperor of the East. Justinian took part in the council meetings. He was the driving force behind all the affairs of the state, and his uncle only signed. He also created his own spy network, employing beggars, dancers, actors and all the scum of the world at that time. He was not a soldier, but the East no longer needed soldiers, and let us recall that he would wrest a large piece of land from the already barbaric Western Empire. The myth persists in textbooks that Justinian was a passive man and that Theodora was the driving force behind everything. This is not true. These two fit together perfectly, although Justinian does not use fish in cisterns to eat the meat from someone's legs to extract testimony from him, or the water test, which will later be used by the Inquisition. Chaining a prisoner so that drops of water fall on the skull, which after a long time will carve a hole in the bone. These are her methods. She also does not murder people in the bathtub. Justinian fights another trend, in a sense monophysical Arianism. They do not recognize the Holy Trinity, but Jesus is already the Son of God only in human form. It is twisted. Professed by God's religion is his enemy, because he wants to unite the empire. If today Arians, tomorrow Nestorians. Justin was not fond of the Monophysites and supported persecution, but it did not extend to Egypt. To what extent it was actually Justin's decision, not Flavius's. Anastasius was a Monophysite. Theodora was 20-something, and had the experience, at least in eroticism, of a 40-year-old, and he was 40 indeed and was supposed to outlive her. After reaching the capital, she was simply invited to Justinian's residence. First, to report, to deliver letters from Macedonia. Many legends arose about this meeting. Justinian was supposed to have gone mad to the point that he was supposed to have offered her the role of a courtesan right at the entrance. Certainly not like that. He could have asked her who she was and for letters. This time, Theodora would not make a mistake. She would listen to what this man had to say and remain silent until she finally achieved her goal. It was very quickly recognized that the techniques of intercourse that Theodora had become familiar with had an influence on this relationship. She had ensnared him. Certainly that too, but analyzing the biography of these people's youth and their way of thinking, we can say that they fit together. There is one difference. Justinian already has the palace and the position Theodora wants. Theodora will be quickly introduced to the most important ones. Suddenly she can talk in a gynaeceum. These are not her mother's teachings. Someone much smarter prepared her for this. It is certainly not without significance that Lucifina, the wife of Uncle Justinian, was a ransomed slave. Both women had something to talk about. It was she who persuaded Theodora to take care of her daughter. What can we do? For the sake of power, we will also be a mother. However, Lucifina eventually opposes this relationship. She wants a matron for her boyfriend. What caused the rift between them? Perhaps she has discovered Theodora's darker side. Justinian is implacable. He believes that her daughter is proof that he will have offspring with his future wife and refers to his uncle. Theodora will never disabuse him of his error. He will believe until the end that he is infertile. She built this relationship on a lie. Right after Lupicina's death, a law is passed that is very beneficial for lovers. Uncle Justin of course signed it. A contrite actress who receives an honorary title and asks for the basileus's permission can enter into a marriage with a notable. This provision is the famous de nuptiis. Theodora triumphs. The fact is that the era also favors this. The thrones are occupied by peasants, illiterates, former slaves, or idiots. Why? The real power is hidden. There are many such Justinians, but they need puppets. This is the legacy of Byzantium. It is much worse. Theodora's daughter, Comito, her friends Chrysomallo, Indaro, Antonina are given in marriage to the most important people in the state. The spouses were not asked for their consent. Historians treat the texts of Procopius with a pinch of salt, who clearly hated Theodora, but everyone agrees that he was right to some extent when he mentioned that Belial sat on the throne in the palace. Anastasius had already begun to turn the elite into a gutter. The world may reproach him for recognizing Odoacer and Theodosius. Justinian finished it. Family patterns are important, however. An inaccessible palace, shrouded in legends, possessing all the relics of Christianity. This symbol of the continuation of Roman virtues, really continues them, but in an antique style. This should not be confused with the law that allowed patricians to marry plebeians known as the lex Canaleia. It already existed. This was a new law and probably one of the first laws introduced solely for the purpose of entering into marriage. The list of lawmakers to do this would later be joined by Jalal-ud-Din Akbar, Suleiman the Magnificent and Henry VIII Tudor. The Middle Ages would soon be upon us. In fact, during Justinian's reign we are already entering this era, the beginning of which is set at the coronation of Odoacer. In this era various things will happen in Byzantium, but a prostitute will certainly not sit on the throne again. Around 524 Justinian fell quite seriously ill. He was supposedly healed miraculously, but it was suspected that he had testicular inflammation. At that time, there was a belief that this led to infertility. It is not known how this relates to the claims that Justinian had a biological son, but it is comfortable for Theodora. Justinian's illness also suited Justin, because his uncle freed himself from his nephew's care and pushed the blue ones away from the manger, but he did not do it alone, because he turned to his other nephew, Germanus. Justinian was seething with anger. Indeed, from that moment on, the party began to fight the government, although Justin's intentions were not entirely senseless. The timing was rather inappropriate. Justinian also partially lost his influence over his uncle, and rebellions began in the country. However, this did not prevent the wedding, which was rather discreet. Justin began to realize that his nephew had taken away his power in the bud and he was not happy about it. This is the first known wedding with the exchange of rings. It was a Monophysite wedding and it seems that Theodora hid her beliefs for some time, because some time later Pope John I blessed her and put a crown on her. In time, Germanus, Theodora, and Flavius would form a strange triumvirate, but Theodora did not like it. Finally, she reminded us that Flavius was the real basileus. Eventually, Germanus would want to seize the throne and organize an uprising with the Goths. This could really unite the world, but he died on the way to Constantine. This happened years after the death of the Despoina. Theodora was very fond of humiliating her petitioners and showing her superiority, especially to the patricians. There were several people with her, and the most faithful and equally ruthless was Antonina, but these were only arrangements based on transactions and if anything happened to her they would betray her. The arrangement with Antonina is downright sick and one can be tempted to say that the two women had something more in common, because Theodora would forgive her all sins and defend her at all costs. As a Despoina, she was truly like a spoiled brat on the throne. She did not grow up to the role and every now and then her primitive origins, which could not be hidden under the purple, were revealed. She was delighted with her position and achieved much more than the proverbial Chinese peak of incompetence. The treasury was emptied for her pleasures, and it was filled with illegal plunder of private estates. Whole time was created new taxes. She knew perfectly well where she came from and how people viewed it, so for this reason alone she changed the course of the audience. From now on, before the despoina and basileus, one had to lie prostrate and kiss slippers. This shows us the real Theodora. A megalomaniac. She really considered herself the incarnation of God on earth, but every now and then a more powerful divine punishment came to her exploits. At the same time, she knew that her power was unstable, and she herself could get bored in bed someday. Justinian might need something more. These demons would constantly circle around her and, combined with megalomania and the past, push her to monstrous acts. The sad truth is that the only person who could erase the name of Theodora's daughter and her mother was herself. Theodora did not want to admit to her shames during her life and after her death. She did it diligently. These two women are her greatest shame. She could force people to kneel and mock them, but in the corridors she heard that. She was the daughter of this one, she was involved in this and not that, she had a child who was no different from her. She could not kill the entire court or the nation. Just like Cosem, who was able to attribute to herself a marriage that did not exist, in order to give herself a higher rank, which was unnecessary, because everyone knew how the harem worked. In this way Theodora erases the black sheep in the family in order to raise her rank. Worse still, natural disasters struck the country. The Monophysites of course claimed that it was God's wrath for Diophysitism and sent letters to Theodora about that. Constantine had a completely different opinion on the subject. During Easter 527, a miracle occurred. Justin, suffering from gangrene, abdicated. He would soon die. It is not known who performed the coronation, which Germanus did not manage to attend, Justin or Patriarch Epiphanius. This Easter is Theodora's greatest performance and everyone agrees on that. Never in the history of the Eastern and Western empires has a woman become an Augusta on the day she took power, until now. Rituals full of Eastern splendor and costumes made of Tyrian purple, something between red and purple, weighing 45 kilograms. On this Easter, a pair of new secular gods were born in Byzantium, who indeed at times considered themselves better than God himself. Certainly, a new Roma came, but Justinian also believed that the state, that is me, many years before Louis XIV. Not all of Theodora's proposals are bad. She is behind the first alimony law in history and shelters for women. Despite this, Justinian indicated in his legal code that women's participation in theatrical performances in which the despoina once performed could be grounds for divorce. He never considered a wife virtuous. Court protocol under Theodora and Justinian reached its peak. This was mainly due to the fact that no matter what was done, the court despised the despoina. A theory was made up that in this way it was proving to the Shah that the only master of the world was the basileus. She fed her sick ambition, and this minor change testifies to her enormous megalomania and by no means modest sanctity. In 531, the monk Saba arrived in the capital, who very quickly figured out Theodora. He was a noble man who created monasteries in the Holy Land and cared for holy places. Theodora put on a performance worthy of herself. She fell at the priest's feet and begged him to pray for her, and to give her husband an heir. She sobbed and cried as she had many years earlier. Saba only responded to her requests with the sentence, "God will watch over your empire. He will preserve it in glory." Many years later the ascetic explained his behavior. He could not pray for a heretic. Palestine was Diophysite, who valued wealth and splendor above all else. Also Mar the Solitary showed no respect for the imperial couple and did not even bother to wash himself, and what he said was what everyone thought but was afraid to say. His last words were quite prophetic, "May your money go to waste with you." Theodora's greatest enemy was John of Cappadocia. An efficient administrator valued by Justinian, he showed her no respect and called her by the name. So she plotted with Antonina, proving that John was plotting against the basileus. Antonina is the wife of the legendary Belisarius, who is by no means happy that he has a woman equal to Theodora, or even worse, as she robs him along with her lover. Many years later, she will pay for her years of cooperation with Theodora. When her husband fights against the Goths in Italy, she will return to the capital for reinforcements. When she discovers that Theodora is already dead, she will resign and will return with anything. Justinian does not need Belisarius, and even less so Antonina and her ambitions. It is not without reason that he fears that she wants to carve out a new kingdom for herself. Justinian was accused of inciting the blues against the greens even in Justin's time. It cannot be ruled out that political chaos was his tool of power. He wouldn't be the first to do something like that to achieve his goal, and he wouldn't be the last. Today, it's the norm. Justinian agreed with his wife on many things, but the plan to take over the souls of the faithful failed. Justinian didn't intend to change the world. Besides, it was a very unrealistic plan. It was possible to take over Constantinople, but the Pope resided in the already barbaric Rome. It would have been necessary to form an alliance with Amalasuntha, and Theodora would never allow that. Just a few months after the death of his uncle, a religious edict was issued. Manichaeism, punishable by death, is mentioned for the first time. Roman citizenship, i.e., the possibility of holding offices in the state, is possible only if someone is a Monophysite. After the Samaritan rebellion, restrictions on worship are also imposed there. At the same time, more and more philosophical and religious trends and currents are developing as if it did not bother anyone, or was done out of spite. It was under Justinian that the last pagan priests were expelled from Philae. Pagans are the most persecuted, and thanks to this the ruler, whom many consider enlightened, will in fact die out. Justinian was tolerant only at home. This also resulted from fears that were perhaps justified for those times. The country will fall apart if each religion has its leader. Everything is also being done to eliminate the Platonic Academy, but they are being fought with caution. The slight persecution of the Monophysites is certainly partly due to Theodora, but in reality there is a more powerful enemy there. Soon there will be a war with Persia, thanks to Theodora and her politic in Rome. Is need to say that clearly. The dispute over one letter was in full swing. A word incarnate in two natures, or about two natures, was a problem. It was known that in the dispute over the nature of Christ, the Monophysites would support their ideology, not the capital, and the Shah could offer them tolerance and take over the land without any problems. At that time, Theodora's daughter is married to a relative of Anastratius, and the grandson will be his namesake. Comitos are Theodora's daughter, Sophia, married Justinian's nephew, Justin. This is the future Justin II. Sophia will be the next empress. At about the same time, Belisarius is forced to marry Antonina, who is much older than him. A widowed woman with children from both marriage and not. Worse, Antonina ridiculed her husband. She ridiculed her husband with body erotic jokes at best. She never became someone from the upper classes. Theodora quickly began to repay the Monophysites and bring them to the capital. In time, all those who considered themselves persecuted came there. However, it is hard to talk about persecution in those times as it would be in the Middle Ages. No one burned at the stake, at most people would fight over opinions and throw stones at each other. It can be said that it is quite civilized by the standards of the history of religious studies. In worser situation were pagans. The Palace of Hormisdas, which was connected to the imperial palace, became a refuge and a place where Theodora received her blessings, and in gratitude, they created her holy. A reminder of those times is the so-called small Haghia Sophia, the church of Saints Sergius and Bacchus. There is one catch, however. The clergy can come to the capital and admire the holy of the emperors, along with the great Severus of Antioch, their leader, but they could not stay in cities and villages. It is a luxurious prison created by Justinian. It is interesting to see if Theodora understood this game. Finally, there were oaths and something strange, because it was stated that Nestorius was a heretic. Justinian tries to add, now known to all, the formula that one of the Trinity suffered in the body. Anastasius had already tried this, but he almost died because of it. The Holy Trinity was not accepted by either side, but by the Pope it was born in the Latin Church anyway. Severus' theology loses supporters to Julian, by the time the Coptic Church changes its theology. Theodora hopes that Severus will be elected Patriarch of Alexandria. In 535, Pope John II, Patriarch Constantini Epiphanios and Alexandria Timothy III die. This is a good opportunity to unite the churches. Theodora brings about the election of Anthem as Patriarch of the capital. Officially he is a Diophysite, but unofficially he is an ally of Severus. However, a new Pope Agapetus arrives from Rome. Theodora miscalculated if she counted on sympathy, and in fact it was he who played this game. Initially Justinian supported his wife, or gave such an impression, because he was a Diophysite, so what changed? Agapetus convinced him, however, that Anthimus was a heretic. Anthimus and Severus were excommunicated, and Severus fled to Egypt thanks to the Despoina. She hid Anthimus in a gynecum in disguise. Justinian discovered this only after Theodora's death. It remains to ask a rather interesting question. How many children did he do at that time? Agapetus died in strange circumstances. Theodora certainly poisoned him. She was counting on the matter to be resolved in Rome, where Asilverius became new pope. In Agapetus's entourage was the capital's nuncio Vigilius, and they were certainly in a frenzy. Theodora believed that he would soften the attitude towards the Monophysites. Theodora's man, who was supposedly secretly a Monophysite. It was a stupid plan, but it shows Theodora's megalomania. Despoina has an argument in the form of Belisarius's army approaching Rome, through which Asilverius would open the gates. Theodora demands his removal latter. It must be admitted that he is showing increasing impudence. And this was the first attempt on the Pope's life, because Silverius was removed to a monastery, and Belisarius appointed his man. This move discouraged the West from the East for good. War had to come. The previous Pope was approved by the ruler of the Goths. Silverius was exiled to the island of Ponza, where he died. He quickly became a saint for the Western Church. By giving the Goths the martyr Theodore, she may have saved Monophysitism, but she led to the permanent division of the empires. Theodora stepped into a mess that she did not understand, because she could not understand. Justinian also did not understand that the West had different needs than the East, but Theodora never had a clue about higher-level politics. What worse, she understands politics just by using weapon and poison. She does everything in a very clumsy, obvious way. Great politics never use that methods. In Byzantium, myths about the Western Empire, which no longer existed, were still alive, but people were not those from that era. Wittage's Goths are forced to fight Byzantium and the Franks. Belisarius occupies Rome for over a year, but the Goths begin a siege. In Milan, Belisarius committed a massacre and killed Vigilius' brother, whose body was thrown to the dogs to be devoured after being quartered. To dogs that were not specially fed. It is not known whether this was Theodora's inspiration, but the effect was obvious. Vigilius no longer wants to cooperate with these people. Apparently, the relationship was not known, or it was show of power, but people changed and time as well changed in Rome. Despoina is not goddess, for it is Constantiniae. Wittages sends an embassy to Persia. Theodora draws Byzantium into war with the Pope, Chosroes Persia and Wittages. These are three fronts. Belisarius discovers that his wife is cheating on him with Theodosius, his adoptive son. Negotiations with Wittages begin. Justinian hears that in Ravenna there are plans to give the Western Empire to the commander. To commander, not to basileus. Maybe Belisarius, like Ibrahim Pasha, forgot who he was. For sure Antonina forgot it. For Theodora, she's more sacred than a god. Severus's and Timothy's plan failed. Theodora did not do what she was created to do. All that was left was to hide in the gynecum. A pathetic end to a very important war in the history of mankind. Justinian was not favorable. Anthem remained at the basileus court only as a memory of his wife. He was not allowed to leave the palace. In a sense, he was a prisoner, although both gentlemen spent a lot of time talking. Without the Pope, Justinian's dream could not come true, and his dream is to unify the empire. It is worth sacrificing the Monophysites and all schismatics for this. Theodora came up with a plan completely divorced from reality. What is worse, Theodora forever alienated two empires. She also made Belisarius start thinking. In Persia, Antonina is imprisoned. Her right hand, which led to the death of John of Cappadocia, disappears for a moment, only to return with greater force. For Theodora, Antonina was untouchable. Belisarius' son, Photius, who sent the property of a corrupt couple of lovers back to the capital wanting to be righteous, was tortured. Photius escaped from the dungeon several times and took refuge in a church seeking asylum. In those times these were places where it was forbidden to touch anyone, but Saint Theodora broke these commandments. Justinian is 60 years old and Theodora 40. Basileus gave too much to the despoina. However, it is not the council and the intrigues in Rome that make it difficult to call this woman a saint, but the Nika uprising, because Justinian and Theodora are not only the ones who created the modern Christian dogmas for all sectarian fractions, but also the Nika revolution. Nika, like every revolt, did not come from nowhere. It is no secret that in order to protect the borders, especially with Persia, Justinian, actually Theodora bought the loyalty of the nomads living on the border and paid them a lot. The great ruler had several bad moves on his account, such as the creation of a province, which he named after his wife. The imperial couple erected numerous buildings to show their power, but people did not necessarily need another church. This mania for erecting churches is characteristic of the culture of the Eastern Church to this day, and due to the architectural canon, where every element is symbolic, these are expensive buildings. Triborian, a lawyer who codified Justinian's law, because he by no means didn't do it alone, was a bribe-taker himself. In addition, there was John of Cappadocia, who, in order to fulfill the emperor's whims, had to look for money, and he did, but he was too specific about the non-payment of taxes, especially by notables, and what is worse, he hit Theodora's relatives. He looked for savings everywhere to the point that he eliminated the legendary courier service. This was the mistake that led to Nika, because the courier service was an important factor in the intermediation of grain sales. The regulation did not hit the owners of latifundia, but small farmers. The poorest and most enterprising carried their grain on their backs to the city to sell it as in the system of ancient China, but not in the China neighboring Justinian. This was done in China several hundred years earlier. John of Cappadocia did not think about one thing in this plan, that at such a rate the grain would reach the capital for months or even years, and we are talking about the largest known city in the knowing world at that time. People quickly began to starve, and the Green and Blue parties exploited this and incited it. The Greens were especially dissatisfied. Theodora certainly started many of the rumors about John and did not foresee the consequences, because she was as disliked as he was. The rebels from both factions were hanged rather unfortunately, because they survived the first time, which the people considered a miracle. The Blues believed that Justinian had betrayed them. Spokesmen for both factions spoke in their defense during the races in the Hippodrome. Suddenly both factions united and had a common enemy. Without a doubt, the basileus meant well by sentencing the instigators of both factions and believed that it would prevent unrest in the city. But hunger was something much more serious, and on top of that, gossip from Theodora's faction and from factions hostile to her reached the streets. Justinian was reprimanded, but he did not answer, only hiding from his box in the palace. Justinian was poor at speaking. Theodora spoke for him. He was a man who preferred true power hidden, so he came off poorly in audiences and in such situations. He had not mastered this art. A sensible answer was enough. Then the legendary Nika, win, resounded in the Hippodrome. People rushed to the city. Districts were burned, prisons were opened. The Senate, Haghia Sophia and the palace vestibule were set on fire. A ban on racing was issued, but it did not help much, because the crowd rushed to the baths. During nights, both factions consulted on what to do next, but about what were they really consulting on? Even if someone threw out a slogan about the peasantry and improving the state of affairs, in reality this coup was only about party interests. Not to mention the fact that the coup was getting out of control, because for years both factions had been pitting one against the other so much that many radicals with narrow horizons believed that it would be best to kill the one associated with the other faction. This is how looks like mostly the contemporary politics of the post-socialistic countries. This is in a sense connected with the stages of the transformation of the country, inscribed in the historical cost, but how this process will proceed depends on whether the society has an open mind and will not allow itself to be manipulated to the end. They demanded the resignation of everyone, even the basileus. Justinian got rid of Triborian and John, but nation remembered Anastasius's nephews. Hypatius and Pompey were imprisoned together with the basileus in the palace. Justinian truly lost his creative power at that time and simply hid in the besieged palace. Belisarius and Mundus used their private armies to restore order, but it did not help much. What is worse, in the heat of the fighting they trampled relics, what gave more power to the upspring. Justinian held his head and became increasingly paranoid. Perhaps he had always had some autistic streak, but now it had come out and he threw Hypatius and Pompey out of the palace. We know that he hated change. Finally, he decided to appear in the lodge, holding a holy scripture. In his first speech, he begged the people to choose a new ruler, and in his second, he begged for forgiveness. Forgiveness was certainly something to be begged for, but Theodora had no intention of giving up the throne. She had fought for it for too long. Worse, after Justinian removed Hypatius from the palace, the people chose him as their leader and seated him in the imperial lodge. He had declared, as a precaution, that he recognized Justinian's authority, but the people saw it differently. Finally, she spoke. Her speech is quite famous, and Theodora must have thought about it for a long time, but she managed to embarrass men with it. Theodora had experienced the effects of the fighting between the two political parties herself, and her cup of bitterness overflowed. She was a despoina, and suddenly she is locked in a palace with someone who was supposed to lay the world at her feet, and when it comes to danger he turns out to be mute. Imperial purple is the most beautiful shroud. I do not intend to live to see the day of exile. There have been many analyses of this famous statement, but they all come down to one simple statement. Do something about it, or I will do something about it once and for all. It was not Justinian's decision, but Belisarius, Mundus, Narses, their private armies, and Theodora. Let's wait until everyone gathers in the hippodrome to celebrate the election of new emperor. Unfortunately, not everyone had on the history lesson something about of the Nika uprising. The army under Belisarius' command rushes out of the palace and heads for the hippodrome. Belisarius entered the hippodrome through the gate of the blue ones. Mundus through the gate of the dead. They are to kill everyone. Their men quickly block the exit from the hippodrome. The mob didn't even notice. Now the purge is coming. It doesn't matter who is what age or gender. No one is to remain alive. Theodora doesn't mind that her daughter is in the family with Hypatius. Brothers are also to die. From now on, she also has the basileus in check. Justinian owes her the throne and his life. Theodora was praised, even though she killed more people than Theodosius the Great did with the same method many years earlier. In fact, Machiavelli himself referred to Theodora's attitude at this point. There was an episode about the idea of the greater good. What is the problem with Nika? That even Cesare Borgia did not kill on Sundays, and we are talking about almost 1,000 years. Theodora should never have become a saint because of this, but somehow she did. The fact is that this solution saved the country and curbed the influence of the Greens and Blues for years. Corpus Juris Civilis, which were included in the Codex Justinianus, Digesta, Novellae. He certainly worked on the latter with his wife. Justinian at that time was focused on conquering the former Western Empire, and Theodora was buying off the Monophysites on the border with Persia. At that time, she castrated Bassianus, who spoke badly of her. Theodora went to Bithynia, which again created many legends. Supposedly to cure infertility. In reality, it was one of her estates. She had her own lands and residence there, just like in Cappadocia, Pontus, Paphlagonia. It was not a cheap trip, because Despoina took giraffes, elephants and all kinds of jewels with her. The promise of new roads was born solely from the fact that Despoina traveled in a litter and was uncomfortable. During the journey, she was accompanied by John of Tella, the same one who saved her. After this departure, there were further theological discussions. This time Justinian tried to reconcile both of these contradictory views. However, this led to the end of the persecutions and the establishment of a Monophysite monastery in the capital. Her private palace in the capital was the Haghia, today in the Fenerbahce district. It was a real fortress, and for centuries the Dapuans and Basileuses, and later also the Sultanas, would maintain this tradition. Unfortunately, it also had its drawbacks, because two centers of power made communication difficult. Ships could not keep up with the circulating between the palace and the Haghia. Theodora had a lover in the Haghia. He was a servant Earabindos. However, when rumors about this began to circulate, she subjected him to inventive tortures and the man died. Theodora was very fond of torture, even for her era. This story makes historians wonder about her sadistic and sexual tendencies. There were rumors that this woman was aroused by the sight of someone being tortured, to orgasm. And analyzing her stormy relationship with the governor, her past, and all the methods she had invented, it is hard to deny this. Justinian turned to Vandalia, where there is also an interesting trend of Arianism. At the same time, he also began to lean towards including the Monophysites from Syria and Egypt. For a short period, Monophysitism did indeed interest Constantinian. She then brought Severus to the capital. Severus skillfully led the dispute with the emperor, but the split was already growing. It was not only about the nature of Christ, which Justinian himself may have doubted, but also about temporality, e.g. national traditions, or such trifles as geographical measures. At that time, Timothy of Alexandria died, which led to riots in that city between the supporters of Gaian and Theodosius. Justinian had a dilemma because he wanted to conquer Vandalita, and it so happened that the patriarch of the capital died at the same time. Did Theodora help him? It is not known. Justinian could not afford to have a Monophysite as patriarch, because Rome, so Anthemos was chosen. John of Cappadocia was opposed to this expedition. The generals were right to be afraid, because the empire had not fought naval wars for a long time. Belisarius and Narses had done well on land, but had not fought at sea. Belisarius and Justinian had more in common than Theodore. They were unable to see certain things. The general had problems at home, and the basileus had problems in the state. Carthage was conquered in 533, and a year later, King Gelimer, who was hiding in Numidia, surrendered. The Vandal kingdom disappeared from the maps. The problem was that the conquest was not complete, but Justinian recalled Belisarius because he was afraid that he would create his own province. The Berbers fought a fierce guerrilla war. In Constantia, Belisarius had his triumph. His prisoner was Gelimer, who was forced to crawl before Justinian, and Belisarius had to kneel. For the first time, someone holding a triumph had to kneel before anyone. Justinian humiliated Belisarius and reminded him that he was the emperor of the world. There was bound to be a quarrel. It was no secret that Belisarius had made a fortune plundering the Vandal country, and Theodora did not want the powerful commander to buy supporters. This is how the idea of an expedition to Italy was born. Belisarius had to be kept alive. Pretend friendship, but at the same time keep him busy with something far from the empire. At the same time, Amalasuntha entered the arena. Justinian's protégé, who had become regent on behalf of her son. Theodora was afraid of her. Amalasuntha planned to go to the capital, and rumors circulated around the city that a wedding would take place, because in this way Western Rome would unite with Eastern Rome. Amalasuntha had a much better position, because her past was not like that of the Despoina. We will probably never know what decisions the cunning Justinian made, but it is a fact that Theodora's trusted man was at the court of the Gothas during the rebellion. Was Justinian already fed up with Theodora? These were still times when having several wives was not surprising. Maybe he planned it. Theodora was a Monophysite, and with Amalasuntha his dream would come true. It is to Theodora that we owe the first regulations defending the rights of women. For example, the possibility of recovering a dowry after the death of the husband. After the death of the wife, the dowry was returned to the woman's family. In the new code, marriage has a significant position. The family began to be the basic social unit. In some matters, however, Byzantium was going backwards. Because divorce by mutual consent was abolished. The centralization of power around the family was intended to push away the quarreling blue and green factions, but not all ideas were good for the citizens. Theodora talked a lot about relationships based on love, but she imposed marriages by force, such as Saturninus with the daughter of Chrysomallo, when she ordered him to be hung on a hook and whipped after he stated in the sideshow that his wife was not a virgin. She certainly was not from that community, but here it is worth emphasizing that Christianity was not interested in virginity until it met Rome. Rome was sick about it, although it was difficult to have any other virgins there than the Vestal virgins. Certainly, the de Lenonibus law, which encouraged taking a closer look at the problem of prostitution, without stigmatizing it, and looking at the local economic situation, was Theodora's idea. It also banned pimping activities and, interestingly, closed brothels in large cities. However, it was a law that existed more on paper than in reality, and in many places it worsened the lives of prostitutes, because it brought about abuses resulting from the marginalization of this profession. Not much has changed in this respect, and today in countries where the law is too restrictive, it harms more than it protects. As a result, Theodora bought some prostitutes, but it was a drop in the ocean of needs. On the Bosphorus, the monastery of penance was established, where prostitutes could convert and learn a profession. Doctors, nuns and widows took care of these women to bring them back to society. However, many women fled this place. Because of the strictures, but also because of the assessment by the employees of the institution, which should not have happened, and bad treatment. This quickly gave rise to jokes about Theodora. The act that was certainly much better for Theodora was the increase in civil servants' salaries. Theodora noticed that a poorly paid civil servant meant corruption. This did not stop corruption, but it significantly reduced it. From the formula of the civil servant swearing in, the confession of sins was born, in the church, but also in the creed. If there was anything that irritated people in this formula at the time, it was the fragment that had already been removed several centuries ago about the most magnificent and mighty wife of Basileus given to us by God. Theodora and Justinian did not live in easy times. In fact, their country was falling apart. The war with Persia triggered the creation of Armenia, which separated for a short time. Komito's husband died then. Justinian focused too much on the west and actually reconquered a lot of territory until Totila was born in the political arena, but over time he was also defeated. Justinian was supported by wealthy elites, and Totila decided to rely on the majority, i.e., poverty. He may have been the first populist, but it worked. In the Danubian area, the Bulgars annihilated Justinian's city. At one point, thanks to his wife's stupid policy and his own megalomania, Justinian waged a war on 4 fronts. Very bad. More and more soldiers were needed, and suddenly it was discovered that even the area around the capital had become depopulated. Adding taxes made the situation worse because there was no one to pay them to a large extent. In 542, the city was struck by plague. What's worse, it parted fast on the beginning, because the tradition of throwing everything unnecessary into the sea was still in full swing. The huge museum collections of Constantini, which is today Istanbul, were created thanks to the fact that the inhabitants were filthy for centuries. Painful truth. The construction of a special tower into which corpses were thrown did not solve the problem, but actually worsened the situation when summer came due to the smell. The epidemic was equaled only by the famous epidemic from the Middle Ages. The plague, as we know, comes from dirt and is spread by rats. This makes us realize that despite intensive construction works in the capital, the ubiquitous boasting of the cleanliness and urbanization of this city was not like that. It must have been dirty. As a result of the plague, the codifier Triborian died, as well as the priest of Theodora Mara Abba. Justinian also fell ill and surprisingly recovered, although he was in his 60s, and his wife was not happy about it, because she concentrated power in her own hands and began to prepare everything to become a basileus, or the wife of a puppet basileus. In the last years of her life, Theodora proved that it was not a love marriage, although some authors want to believe it. She deceived Justinian, but he sobered up at times. She quickly became involved in religion, as well as pushing away people associated with her husband that she did not like. However, she was brutal in punishing officials, even for not showing up for work, and in the era of war on 4 fronts, bacillus disease, after whose death she would have been kicked to the depths to the gynaeceum, that is, the harem, and then the monastery, and the epidemic. It was a serious mistake, which worse Theodora began to interfere with the generals on how to conduct wars, although she had no idea about it, but she thought otherwise in her divinity. In such situations, conspiracies are born, such as rebellion of John, the son of Vitalian, whom Justinian killed many years ago. Belisarius was in Persia. It would have been reasonable to dismiss him, but this was not done. Totila regained the Byzantine colonial territories very quickly. In this situation, another ugly truth about Theodora appears to us. There is a saying in Russia that a whore will remain a whore, and there is another saying that politics is the biggest whore and has no equal. Each of them, although vulgar and known for what reasons they were created, suits to Theodora. Theodora is not watching over her husband at all. She does not intend to go to the monastery after his death. He hates Belisarius, but he knows that as an outstanding general he has the support of the army, and in the capital they want him as their successor. Although she officially vowed to sacrifice her soul in exchange for basileus recovery in a huge, expensive show, at the same time she plans to divorce Antonina and marry Belisarius. Was Belisarius conspiring in Persia and, to make things even funnier, dismissed because allegedly Theodora's spy had heard something, and his name was John the Glutton? Or does Theodora want to force him to return, because the leader was acquitted as soon as he crossed the walls? The alleged second conspirator, Buzzes, disappeared in the cisterns of Haghia Sophia. What was the offense? Well, John the Glutton heard that the only emperor was Justinian and no one else. Theodora therefore considered herself a basileus. When Justinian recovers, he pretends that nothing has happened, but he does not stop fighting for the throne. He wants her descendants to sit on the throne. He wants a new dynasty, and matchmakers are needed. She wants to see Belisarius dead again, even though she needed him, but Justinian has a different opinion. Probably because he didn't agree on her plan. Despite this, she managed to keep Belisarius in house prison and deprived of his private army. She also changed her attitude towards Antonina and deprived them of their joint property, but Antonina has a huge fortune of her own, which was created by stealing from her husband, and it remains untouched. Here we see Antonina's nature, which is as primitive as Theodora's. And it should be a warning to all of us, reminding us of what happens when we bring a pariah to the top. Belisarius must kneel in front of naked Antonina, who is having fun with her lover. He certainly regretted not joining the Goths. Theodora plans the wedding of Belisarius' daughter with her daughter's son. He hates him, but he wants power and his own dynasty. He wants to take over the dowry about which legends circulate. While Belisarius fights Totila, Theodora begins to create a new biography of herself. That's when the story of her life begins to change. She plans to take over after her husband's death. She also sabotages her husband's decisions. He doesn't hide it anymore, and Justinian allows it. Many historians believe that Justinian did not suffer from the plague, but had a stroke. His recovery was very long indeed, although one thing does not exclude the other. She even ordered Janine to live with Anastasius without marriage, which is unacceptable in noble families, and could result in excommunication, which was threatened to but she coped with it. A dynasty born from her womb, not her spouse. He already knows that he has cancer and he is in a hurry, and as he rushes he discovers his intentions more and more. Justinian and Antonina will not fulfill any of her last wishes. Antonina does not hide that the idea disgraces her daughter, but the strange relationship between these women takes over for a moment. When the plan fails, he puts everything on Justin, who is mentally ill. The year is 548. Theodora dies of cancer. In convulsions. If divine punishment befalls anyone, it will certainly be her. Hormonal tumors are one of the types of cancers that are unbearable for both the patient and his family. We have all known this in my family for 400 years. Theodora was rotting while she was alive, even falling apart. The cancer had spread to the breast. Gangrene set in. If she ever complained about the stench of Justinian lying there, she must have been shocked that her husband didn't do it. She was 48 or 51 years old. Justinian was to live to the age of 83. He outlived Theodora by 17 years. The plan to take over the throne failed, as did the plan to remove Diophysitism. In 545, Persia and Byzantium sign a truce. It is expensive for Byzantium, and the Shah comes to the capital with his entire family and entourage, only 500 people. This time Justinian learns his lesson. He is already sick. Justinian and Theodora humiliated many for years. Chosroes isn't going to pretend it didn't happen. He still has the fate of his ambassador in his mind. He mocks Justinian, and the Shah's entourage reminds everyone that although Justinian shouted, "Solomon, I defeated you," he is by no means equal to Solomon. The country is poor. Justinian humiliates himself in an incredible way for the Shah just to please him. Despite this, he continues to fight for the unification of empires. He officially idolized his wife, but he already knows who he lived with, and he certainly does not intend to subordinate the world to Monophysitism. Rome does not want Monophysitism, and it wants Rome. Justinian at that time realized that whatever his religious beliefs were, they must conform to what the Pope thinks, because without it he will not gain an empire. Perhaps he thought that one day he would then deal like with the pagans, but then he would really have no idea of the situation. And how was Theodora buried? Maybe this is his silent revenge. The last rites were given to her by a Monophysite. Theodora is fascinating, and there are many legends and myths around her, but the truth is much more interesting and does not show a wise and powerful ruler who is associated with the famous mosaic in Ravenna. They say it was created by her former lover. Maybe. Certainly one of the few who loved Theodora. Theodora is a mosaic, but it is by no means what the mosaic was intended to represent. She is certainly a powerful devil, or perhaps a demon, leading Byzantium straight into the abyss. The abyss of wars, the destruction of the population. He is the first known ruler to use terror on such a large scale. He was certainly the first sadist in history to act so openly. Donatien actually described what he saw at the court of Louis XV, but how much of it did he himself, although he was certainly a son of the era? We do not know. Nothing was ever proven against him, and 120 Days of Sodom was supposed to be a mockery book. That's what they are, but unfortunately most people who don't have the knowledge don't see it. Just as the majority who have no knowledge continue to honor Theodora as a saint. She shouldn't be in the annals. No convert is equal to her in sinning. She was falling further and further. Cosem will be equally brutal. Perhaps she chose basileus as her role model. The creation of the creed does little to erase Theodora's guilt. Monophysitism survived thanks to Theodora, but not on the scale she wanted. The removal of the Goths who believed in a similar dogma also contributed to this. Rome will have the Holy Trinity. Justinian will not object. Today, even people from areas where Monophysitism exists do not know that they are dealing with Monophysites. Justinian's dogma 1. One more legend remains. When Justinian finished Haghia, Sophia was said to have exclaimed inside her, "Solomon, I have defeated you." This was referenced in the TV series Magnificent Century and many films about Suleiman the Magnificent. Certainly a much better ruler of Constantine. Suleiman read a lot about Justinian and wanted to be like him. He wanted to be the Muslim Justinian, even though he was much more powerful. He wielded much more power than the emperor. Contrary to some opinions, Suleiman was not manipulated by anyone. After building Suleymaniya, he exclaimed, "Solomon cannot be defeated, Justinian." Solomon is the Hebrew version of the name Suleiman. Many compare these two rulers. Many events are similar, but Harem would never betray Suleiman like Theodora, nor would she be senselessly cruel. Forced to fight for the throne by the system and not her own ambitions, she did what she had to do. However, she never acted in such an obvious way or tormented her victims. Only by sitting on the throne could her son survive. If Theodora had lived a little longer, she would certainly have gotten rid of Justinian to take power herself, although this would certainly have ended with her overthrow. The terror she spread, the religious disputes and wars would lead to a bloodbath. By averting his eyes from this, Justinian allowed her to push Byzantium into ruin, which came quite quickly at the end of the first act of this empire. The famous pair of rulers contributed largely to this. Suleiman and Harem turned Constantine into a power that everyone had to reckon with. It was he and Habsburg who dealt the cards in Europe. The rest was appendix. After Theodora's death, Justinian becomes a shadow of himself. Rome was regained again, but not for long. Gregory the Great excommunicates Saint Theodora, and her tomb is plundered and desecrated during the Fourth Crusade. Antonina loses support, and Belisarius has to fend for himself. Could it be that colonialism wasn't entirely Basileus's idea? Germanus starts an uprising. Justinian will live to see the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, but this will no longer be his problem. The plague epidemic was named after him. Haghia Sophia is the most powerful symbol of his rule. It is a symbol of Byzantium. It is something even more powerful than Jerusalem, despite appearances for this part of the world. It is a monument to megalomania, like the one opposite Ahmetkami, but also a symbol of continuity and power. Haghia has had many meanings from the beginning, but they all revolve around power. Just as Salah ad-Din answered the question of Baldwin, not Balian, the influential brother was omitted in the film so as not to confuse people by the same names. What is Jerusalem? Nothing. Everything. The same can be said about Haghia. It's a building. A church like many others. Jerusalem is strategically a useless city, but it rules the souls of the world. Haghia was the gateway to the Orient. Politically, it ruled that part of the world. It was here that Justinian announced his decrees. Each basileus did that. Always associated with politics and the state, it had to be renamed a mosque by Mehmed Fatih. It was a prudent move, although to this day it is still understood by laymen and people not fully familiar with their own history and faith. If Fatih wanted to have Constantini, he had to have the most powerful symbol of power, and that was this building. If Fatih wanted to be the lord of this empire, he had to have this building under the new dynasty. If Fatih wanted to legitimize his power over the Orient, he had to have this building. A building that restored rotunda-shaped buildings with a dome to architecture. There is probably one conclusion from this story. We all have a chance to be both an emperor and a saint. The worse we are, the better. This is my photo from Milano. Milano was the capital of the Western Empire towards the end, until its fall. It is worth remembering that it was not always Rome. The capital of United Italy was initially Turin.